see all of them here this morning. It's especially good to see Linda Boner with us this morning. Linda, you bring a ray of sunshine with you. We're glad to have you back with us. After having such a long stretch of one problem after another. Remember the Senior Citizens Appreciation Dinner next Saturday night. Everyone, of course, is invited to be there to celebrate our senior citizens and to enjoy one another's company. But if you are a senior citizen, then the church will pick up the tab for your meal. No, we don't check driver's license, so you can't fudge on this. But you come and we'll enjoy a good meal together at Miami's in Cynthiana. I hope to see a good crowd there. We always have a good crowd. Do you remember, if you're old enough, do you remember where you were when you heard that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated? I, of course, was not born then, so I can't remember it, but I remember my mom talking about her, where she was when she heard that President Kennedy had been assassinated in November of 1963. I do remember where I was when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. That was in 1986. I was 15 years old, and it was on a Sunday. We had just gotten home from worship services. Mom was fixing lunch in the kitchen, and I had just turned the corner to go into the living room. I don't know who had already turned on the TV, but I just turned the corner going into the living room, and it was right then when the explosion happened. That was the shuttle that the school teacher, Krista McCullough, was on, if you remember. Do you remember where you were on 9/11? Most of us are old enough now to remember 9/11. We have the 11th anniversary of it Tuesday, when Muslims hijacked airplanes and crashed them into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon. The fourth plane was intended either to fly into the Capitol building or the White House. I don't know if they know which one was the intended target, but the passengers, of course, wrested control of the airplane from the terrorists and crashed it into the ground. And that act right there, perhaps more than any other act of heroism, astounds me. The people on that particular airplane, it didn't matter if they were Democrat or Republican, they gave up their lives to save the people who were in the Capitol or the White House. At that particular moment, nothing else mattered but saving other people's lives. And they gave their own life for it. Just the modern day that will live in infamy, to borrow the words that Roosevelt used in reference to Pearl Harbor. 2,975 of our fellow Americans died that day. Now that particular Tuesday morning started off like Monday did. People got up and they went to work. They thought when they got out of bed that that day would be like any other day. It did not matter if they were old or if they were young. Death came that day to almost 3,000 people, totally unexpected. There were some grandfathers and grandmothers, and there were some aunts and uncles, and there were brothers and sisters. Some of them left things that were unsaid. Some of them left with things that they wished they had done. But death came unexpectedly to all of those people. Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, "The fate of the sons of men and the fate of the beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. They all have the same breath, but there is no advantage for man over beast." That is, as far as death is concerned, Solomon is talking about because everybody dies. Every living thing, whether it's plant or animal or human being, has an appointment with death at some point. Where were you on that fateful day when the world stopped turning. One of our couples on our mission team was in the States to have their second child. The second couple on our mission team had just had their second child, and they were scheduled to leave the States that very day. Rachel and I were there in Yosh, Romania by ourselves, and that particular day, the church that we were working with in Yosh was taking food supplies to some people who lived in an abandoned apartment building. This was a huge apartment building, probably could house at one time, when it was still occupied, probably could house 400 people or more. And there was probably 100 people living in it. It was burned out. Didn't have any windows on it, no doors, no running water, no electricity. But about 100 people or so living there in that building. And so we took food supplies for them. I was there with several Romanian Christians. And a non-Christian friend of ours named Mariana saw what was happening on CNN. We could get CNN in Romania, and she saw what was happening. She called Rachel up. This particular friend had lived in New York herself for several years, a decade or so. She called Rachel up to talk to her about it. She found out I wasn't there. She said, "Where is Paul?" And Rachel told her where I was, what zone I was in of the city. And so a woman sent a friend of hers to come get me because she felt like we should be together as a family. Of course, Anna wasn't born at that point. And when Christian got there, here's what he told me. Now, this is right after things had just happened, and we didn't know, what was going on and who was behind it. This is what he told me. He said, "Paul, there are planes flying over the United States dropping bombs. And you need to come home and be with Rachel." That was my first introduction to 9/11. When a national tragedy like that happens, our world stops turning. If you were like me, you probably were. You were riveted to the TV set. And if you couldn't be at the TV set, you turned on the radio. Or maybe you looked on the internet because you wanted to know what is going on. Who is responsible for it? And perhaps you were fascinated like I was about all those acts of heroism. People giving their lives in order to get people out of those towers and the Pentagon. Nothing else matters when something like that happens. And in fact, if you were a family member of one of those who were killed on that day, or even one who was injured, everything else pales in comparison to importance. Nothing else in the world matters except that event right there. And for a while, it seems like the world just stops turning. One of the most surreal scenes, I think, is to watch that tragedy happening on TV, and they mute the sound. You can't hear anything except the people running out of those towers covered in ashes. This morning, I want us to look at 3 examples out of the Bible when the world stopped turning, and ask ourselves, are we prepared in our life for the world to stop turning? The first example I want us to think about is the people during the days of Noah's flood. Genesis chapter 6, 7, and 8. God had preached through Noah. Noah was a preacher of righteousness, and the first word of chapter 6 tells us that Noah preached for 120 years while he was building the ark. As far as we know, it had never rained. Perhaps it did, but the Bible does not refer to it. And Noah preached that God is going to destroy the world with a flood. I don't know if some of those people helped Noah build the ark. It was a huge project. May very well have been that other people helped Noah and his sons and the rest of his family build the ark. But Noah preached it and tried to get them to change their behavior and be ready for when the flood happens and get on the ark. God didn't tell them when the rain was going to start. God had Noah get all the animals, bring them onto the ark, And when God had Noah and his wife and 3 sons and their 3 wives, 8 people on the ark, then God shut the door. And when the door was shut, nobody could open it. Not even Noah could open the door. God had given those people time to get their lives right. He had given them time and opportunity to repent, and they did not. We can imagine them saying, you know what, it has never rained before. I don't trust Noah. He's talking about something that has never happened before. I don't believe it's going to happen. Everything is going to go along in the future just like it has in the past. Until those first drops of rain started coming down. Look at what Moses writes in Genesis chapter 7, verses 21 through 23. God opened the floodgates of heaven, and He broke open the fountains of the great deep. And there was more water on the earth at that time than there has ever been before. And the Bible says, verse 21, all flesh that moved on the earth perished. And in order to emphasize that point, Moses lists the animals in broad groups. Birds and cattle and beasts and every swarming thing that swarms upon the earth and all mankind. Noah's grandma and grandpa died in the flood. Mrs. Noah's aunts and uncles died in the flood. All of their cousins died in the flood. Their next door neighbors who had pitched their tent beside them died in the flood. All of those people who had given their time and their energy and their talents and their blood and sweat to help Noah build the ark, if in fact they did help Noah build the ark, they all perished in the flood. All mankind died except Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives. All mankind died, verse 22, of all that was on the dry land, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life died. And thus God blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and the birds of the sky, and they were blotted out from the earth, and only Noah was left together with those that were with him in the ark. You know, when God decides to fulfill one of His promises, it doesn't matter how many obey and how many don't. God doesn't count noses to see whether the majority are obeying Him or not. When God decides that He's going to take a particular action, He warns man, this is what's going to happen, and it's up to man to submit himself to the will of God. And when God closes the door, that's it. There were a lot of people on that day who were not finished living their lives. Jesus refers to that event in Matthew chapter 24, and He's talking about the coming of the Son of Man, the second coming, but He says, for as in the days of Noah, so will also be the days of the coming of the Son of Man. For in those days before the flood, Jesus says, they were eating, and they were drinking, they were marrying, and they were giving in marriage. They were living their lives normally on Tuesday, just like they had done it on Monday, unaware that God keeps His promises until that fateful day when the flood came. They weren't finished living their lives, and they were not prepared for death. The second example I want us to look at is the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Flip over to Genesis chapter 19. Genesis chapter 19, we studied this passage a few weeks ago on the subject of homosexuality, but let's pick up at the tail end of the story. The angels have come to Lot, and Lot was a righteous man, and Lot had done his best to try to get the people of Sodom and Gomorrah to live righteous lives. Jude, the Lord's brother, talks about that at the end of the New Testament. So Lot was also a preacher, trying to get his neighbors to do what was right. But jump down to verse 12, Genesis